Hi everyone, thank you for joining us online today for Friday Focus. For those of you that are not familiar with this format, Friday Focus is an online talk series hosted by the Hunterian, and we are the museum and art gallery at the University of Glasgow. And in each edition of these talks, we'll hear from a different speaker covering a different topic. And we tend to look at our exhibitions and displays that are happening across our venues, as well as research that goes on at the Hunterian and across the University of Glasgow, and all the exciting work that goes on behind the scenes with our collections. So this year in 2025, Glasgow is celebrating its 850th anniversary. And at the Hunterian, we're marking the occasion with a series of exhibitions and displays, events and blogs that explore Glasgow's history, its identity, and also reflecting on the way that the city has transformed over those years. So today I'm really pleased to be joined by my colleague Joseph Sharples, who's going to talk to us today about a display that he's curated, which just opened at the end of last month in Kelvin Hall. And that looks at three iconic or historic Glasgow buildings that have been demolished, but their memories live on in interesting ways through objects in the Hunterian collections. So Joseph is going to give us a bit of a presentation, and then there'll be some time at the end for any questions that you might have. And you can pop your questions in the chat by clicking on the speech bubble at the bottom of your screen, and I will read those out for you at the very end. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us online today, and I will hand over to Joseph now to deliver this week's talk.
Thanks very much, Eleni, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. As Eleni explained, I'm going to be talking today about a recently opened display at Kelvin Hall, which is one of three exhibitions that the Hunterian is doing to mark the 850th birthday of Glasgow, the 850th anniversary of Glasgow being made a borough, which is being celebrated all across the city. So in the summer, there's going to be an exhibition at the Hunterian Art Gallery about the Glasgow coat of arms. And in the autumn, there'll be another exhibition at the Hunterian Art Gallery consisting of views of Glasgow from our collections. But the display that I'm going to be talking about today has recently opened at Kelvin Hall, which is the site of the Hunterian's stored collections and also our offices. And the exhibition is in the main public corridor here in this building, and you can see it here. So it's a busy space where people come and go to use the various facilities on offer in Kelvin Hall, sports facilities, the National Library of Scotland, as well as the Hunterian's offices. And this is an overview of the exhibition. The idea behind the display is to take a look at the fact that cities are always changing. Cities like Glasgow are in a constant state of flux, and buildings are constantly being demolished and replaced. It's happening all the time. And when they're gone, it can sometimes be difficult to remember what they look like. And huge structures, which literally dominate our lives, can disappear in a very short time. Some of you will be familiar, I'm sure, with this example that's taken place very recently in Glasgow. So these were the Wynford flats, blocks of multi-storey flats dominating the skyline of northwest Glasgow since the 1960s. And a couple of weeks ago, this happened. And those huge buildings ceased to exist, just became piles of rubble. It's a familiar story in cities across the UK, and among them Glasgow, especially in the years after the Second World War. There was redevelopment on an enormous scale in British cities, and many historic buildings were demolished to make way, especially for road schemes. And there's an absolutely outstanding example of that right in the centre of Glasgow, where the M8 was driven through the Charing Cross area, and enormous numbers of Victorian buildings were demolished to make way for it. And this is the site we see today. And that scale of demolition is still going on today. Well, maybe not on that scale, but anyway, prominent public buildings in main city centre streets are disappearing all the time. So on the right here, 92 to 106 Sauchiehall Street, there was a nightclub there was a fire about 3 years ago. The building was demolished and the site remains empty. And on the left here, the O2 ABC in Sauchiehall Street, damaged in the fire that gutted the School of Art, which you can see behind, and currently in a state of partial demolition. And presumably in due course, the whole site will be cleared. And I've already forgotten what the building at 92 to 106 Sauchiehall Street looked like. And I suspect the O2 will fade from our memories as time goes by. So what the exhibition is trying to do, what the display is trying to do, is to look at ways in which we remember buildings after they've been demolished, how they linger on in our memories, how they're commemorated, memorialized, preserved. And the display occupies 3 cases, and conveniently, we have interesting examples of the memorialization of 3 buildings in our collections. And so it seemed a good idea to focus on one building in each of these 3 cases and say something about how its memory has been preserved through objects in the Hunterian collection. The first building that we look at in the first case is the old college in the High Street in the east end of the city. This was the original home of the University of Glasgow. The main building that you can see in this watercolour from the later 19th century dates from the 17th century, and it was a very distinguished and ambitious piece of Scottish Renaissance architecture. When these buildings were erected in the 17th century and subsequently, the High Street was the centre of Glasgow. It was where important people lived and business was done and so on. By the middle of the 19th century, that had changed completely, and wealthy people had moved westward. The city was expanding westward. New affluent residential areas were opening up to the west, and the High Street and the area around it went down in the world, became dominated by overcrowded slum housing and by polluting industries. And it was no longer a place that the university wanted to be. And so they moved to a brand new building in the West End. And that move was made possible by the sale of these old buildings to a railway company who wanted to develop the site as a goods yard and a goods station. And so these venerable old buildings were demolished, and there's no trace of them on the site today. Their importance was recognised at the time, and there were voices raised in opposition to their demolition. But in the end, practical considerations outweighed those historical considerations, and the buildings were demolished. However, parts of them were preserved. They were carefully salvaged during the course of demolition and incorporated into the university's new buildings in the West End of Glasgow, here at Gilmore Hill. So notably, this elaborate staircase that you can see in a watercolour on the left here, known as the Lion and Unicorn staircase, because it has statues of those 2 heraldic animals on the balustrade. This was dismantled and brought to Gilmore Hill and incorporated into the new buildings being erected there for the university in the 1860s. And other decorative carved work from the demolished buildings in the High Street was incorporated into this gate lodge on University Avenue that gives access to the new university buildings. And you might recognise from the watercolour we've just seen the elaborate entrance arch in this gate lodge with the sculpture above it, and also those projecting balconies and the gables above the windows. All these carved stone details came from the building in the High Street and were brought and incorporated into the new buildings in the West End. And they were not only built into this lodge, they were then, I think the word we would use today is distressed, to make them not stand out from the new stonework around them. So they were darkened with a mixture of oil and soot, so that they didn't look, so the surrounding stones were darkened, so they didn't contrast with the old stones that had been brought from the High Street. So that's one way in which the high street buildings were preserved um, following their demolition. But also, fragments of the structure as it was being demolished were salvaged and then made into a variety of souvenir objects, some of which have found their way into our collection and which are on display as part of building memories. The key item here is the one in the bottom right, which is a little egg cup. I mean, the fact that it's an egg cup tells you how small it is. It's the size of an egg. And this was given to the Hunterian, I think, round about the year 2000 by uh, a descendant of the person who made it. And the person who gave it to the Hunterian was himself aged 100 when he gave it to us. So that takes us right back to the beginning of the 20th century when he was born. And his father had been a joiner who worked on the dismantling of the old college in the 1880s. And he told his family, and the story was handed down through the generations, how when this work of demolition was going on, people would come to the building site offering money to the workmen for pieces of wood from the building that could then be turned into souvenirs or be mementos of this distinguished and important building. And so the workmen would cut pieces of wood and give them to these sightseers who came to the demolition site. But the donor's father also saved a piece of wood for himself, for his own purposes, and it was in rather poor condition, but he managed to find a sound piece of wood just big enough to make this egg cup. And that was a treasured possession of the family, and they very generously gave it to the Hunterian. So that gives us a nice personal insight into how probably all these objects were made by people who salvaged wood from the building or obtained salvaged wood from the building and then made them into these various objects. And sometimes the objects have got inscriptions either carved into the wood or applied in the form of an engraved metal tablet explaining exactly where in the building they came from. So I think the wooden box came from the wood salvaged from the Senate room of the old college. The goblet in the centre there came from a piece of wood from the fore hall, I think. The strange object on the left, it isn't immediately obvious what this is to modern eyes, but it's actually a pen holder. So if you imagine the days when people wrote with pens that you dipped in liquid ink, you needed a place to rest those pens in between writing. And this object allows you to rest up to 7 pens on those notched circles of wood at either end of it. So you'd lay a pen between the notches in the 2 circles of wood, and you could have up to 7 pens there. And this pen holder continued in use in the new university until the mid-20th century, when it was taken out of use and given over to the Hunterian. And I suspect the sort of scuffs and scars you can see on it are a reflection of the fact that it was in use for all those decades. The second building that features in this display is the building erected for the 1888 International Exhibition in Glasgow. This was an event of huge significance in the history of Glasgow. It was modelled on the great exhibition held in 1851 in London in the Crystal Palace, which gave birth to a whole series of these huge international trade exhibitions around the world in the succeeding decades. And Glasgow held its first such exhibition in 1888, and it was a huge popular success. And another one was held in 1901 and another in 1911. And there was finally the Empire exhibition held in 1938. But the first was this international exhibition held in 1888. And this is rather different from the old college building, because the building to house the international exhibition was only ever intended to be temporary. It wasn't a permanent structure. It was built just to last for the duration of the exhibition. And for those of you who know Glasgow, it stood on the site now occupied by the bowling greens next to the Kelvingrove Museum and Art Gallery. This old photograph on the left gives you an idea of its architecture, its style. It was designed by James Sellers, an important Glasgow architect, in this very, well, I think the word is exotic style. It was described as Oriental at the time, and it draws on the architecture of uh, Islamic Spain and India and other parts of the Near and Far East to create this very exuberant, rich, decorative building. It's a fanciful building. It's not an imitation of any particular style or period, but a very romantic building, as you can see from this painting on the right by John Lavery, which shows it at dusk with lanterns illuminating it. And you can, I think, readily see from this what an exciting place it would have been to visit, how beautiful and how atmospheric. You can probably see in the photograph on the left, or possibly see, that the two octagonal turrets with spires on top are made of brick. I think you can just about see that from the photograph. But most of the building was made of wood. It was a timber building and painted with, decoratively, but essentially a lightweight timber structure. You can see that more clearly inside the building in this engraving that was published in the Illustrated London News at the time of the exhibition, and you can clearly see the timber structure of the roof and large areas of glazing to light these enormous spaces inside where the exhibited goods were on display. And I think you can also see the horizontal timber planking of the inner surface of the walls in this photograph. So the building was temporary and it disappeared once the exhibition was over. But the image of it lived on and lives on in an enormous number of souvenirs that were produced to commemorate it during its run. We've got 3 medals on display in the exhibition, of which one is reproduced here, which were, I think, sold as souvenirs. This one may have been designed to be awarded as a prize in competitions associated with the exhibition, but it's blank on the other side, so we don't know how it might have been used. But it's got this very striking image on the side that it's illustrated here of these 2 classical gods, Hermes and Hercules, nude classical figures seated on the banks of the river Kelvin with the museum building in the background. Another romantic vision of this extraordinary building that appeared just for 12 months in the West End of Glasgow. But more numerous than the medals are the pieces of decorated pottery which commemorate the 1888 exhibition, and some examples are illustrated here. So we've got several jugs like the one on the left here. We're looking at the exhibition buildings here from the north side, from the university side, from the Kelvingrove Park side, and you can see the River Kelvin running across in front of the exhibition buildings there. Interestingly, this jug has an image of the city chambers on the back of it, because it was produced at the time of the official opening of the city chambers, which was carried out by Queen Victoria when she visited Glasgow and also visited the exhibition. And on the right-hand side are 2 views of, well, it sort of looks like a flat iron, actually, a ceramic flat iron, but it's a cheese dish. And this is the cover for it. And again, decorated with this image of the exhibition buildings and Glasgow's coat of arms and motto, Let Glasgow Flourish. But all these objects show how the image of the exhibition building itself became a symbol of the exhibition, instantly recognizable. And preserved for posterity in objects like this. And it's important to remember in this context that the pottery industry was very important in Scotland generally, and Glasgow in particular, in the 19th century. And so the exhibition came as a kind of gift to the pottery industry to produce all this commemorative ware in connection with this special occasion. Commemorative ware is a tradition that continues today, and we were lucky to be able to include in the display this plate, which has just been produced to commemorate Glasgow's 850th anniversary, commissioned by the Lord Provost from a local group called Make It Glasgow, who are exploring the ceramic history of Glasgow and working towards displays that celebrate that, and potentially a museum of Scottish pottery. And they have produced this rather beautiful plate based in its overall design on 19th century examples of Glasgow pottery. But if you look closely at it, you can see it's delightfully and imaginatively updated to the present day. And why it's relevant to our exhibition is that it includes images of 4 buildings that will be familiar to anyone who knows Glasgow. So you'll see that round the edge of the plate, you can see in the bottom left, the Finnieston Crane, and the bottom right, the Armadillo. Top left is the McLennan Arch from Glasgow Green, and top right, with those stars bursting from it, is the spire of the university here in the West End. So this is a nice reminder of the continuing importance of ceramics as a way of commemorating buildings. And the third and final section of the display is devoted, well, not really to individual objects that memorialize a building, but to an entire building which has passed into the collection of the Hunterian. This is 78 Southpark Avenue, which was the final Glasgow home of the architect Charles Rennie Mackintosh and his artist wife, Margaret Macdonald. They lived here from 1906 to 1914, when they left Glasgow for good, as it turned out. They rented the house out for a while, and then they sold it to a friend and supporter of theirs, a man called William Davidson. And when he died in 1945, the house was bought by the University of Glasgow. And the contents, the Mackintosh furniture, was gifted to the university by William Davidson's sons at the same time. So the house and its surviving Mackintosh contents became the property of the university in the 1940s. And it was used as lodgings for university professors. And then in the 1960s, along with universities throughout the UK, Glasgow started to expand and build more buildings for teaching and so on. And it was discovered that the house at 78 Southpark Avenue stood in the way of one of these projected buildings that the university intended to build. And so the decision was taken, and it was not uncontroversial at the time, but the decision was taken to demolish the house. The then professor of fine art at Glasgow University, Andrew McLaren Young, recognised the great importance of Mackintosh's interiors, and so arranged for the interior of the house to be meticulously recorded with measured drawings and photographs. And then, before the house was demolished, everything that could be removed from it was removed, including, skirting boards and doors and door cases and window surrounds, as well as the Mackintosh designed elements. They were all removed and put into storage because Andrew McLaren Young had this idea that the whole house could be, or its interiors at least, could be reconstructed in a purpose-designed wing of the planned University Art Gallery, the planned Hunterian Art Gallery, which was at that date in the 1960s on the drawing board. These 3 photographs show how that goal was achieved over the next 20 years or so. So on the left is a photograph of 78 Southpark Avenue shortly before its demolition, a Victorian terraced house with a 2-story bay window. You can just about see down the left-hand side of that photograph the long window on the first floor that Mackintosh introduced to the Victorian house to light the studio drawing room on the first floor. In the centre photograph, you can see the Mackintosh house, the dedicated wing of the Hunterian Art Gallery, under construction. And you can see the long rectangular horizontal opening on the first floor corresponding to that window. And if you look at the front door of the house, you can see the actual window that had been salvaged from 78 Southpark Avenue 15 years earlier or so, sticking out of the front door, waiting to be fitted into that opening on the first floor. when the time came. And on the right, you can see what the Mackintosh house looks like today. Strange mixture of this brutalist 1970s exterior, which gives odd hints of what's going on inside, but is a complete contrast with the preserved Mackintosh interiors, which meet you when you go inside. And finally, I just want to look at a couple of items in this case devoted to the Mackintosh house. So really, it's the whole house, or the interiors of the whole house, which constitute the Mackintosh house as it now exists in the Hunterian's collections. But I just wanted to draw attention to a couple of the things we've got on display in this case. So you can see these two strange pieces of metal that dominate the case, with projecting brackets punctured with grids of square holes. These follow the design of the hobs that stand on either side of the fireplace in the studio drawing room on the first floor of the Mackintosh house, which came from 78 Southpark Avenue. And before that, we're in the city centre flat where the Mackintoshes lived before they moved to the West End. And if you visit the Mackintosh house, you can see those hobs still in place on either side of the fireplace in the studio drawing room. In the background of this display, in the photograph on the left here, you can see a photograph of the Mackintoshes' flat in the city centre before they moved to the house in Southpark Avenue. And you might just be able to make out the hobs on either side of the fireplace there. This fireplace they brought with them to the West End, 78 Southpark Avenue, and then it was moved from 78 Southpark Avenue to the Mackintosh house in the art gallery. These two pieces of metal on display, they follow the design of those hobs, but well, I'll be perfectly honest, we don't know what their history is, but we speculate that they were probably made in the 1960s as copies of the originals, possibly for use in a big exhibition of Mackintosh's work, which was held in 1968, the centenary of Mackintosh's birth. It was held at the Royal Scottish Museum in Edinburgh. And it included a reconstruction of this fireplace. And it's possible that these brackets were made for that exhibition. So they're not original Mackintosh pieces, but they're attempting to copy his original design. Also in the showcase, just on the left, you can see a tobacco tin, a rather colourful tobacco tin with some ceramic tiles in it. These were among items salvaged before the demolition of the house, but which were not reused in the recreation of the interiors as the Mackintosh house in the art gallery. And on the right of the left-hand photograph, you can see a little display of keys, and on the right of the screen is a close-up of one of those keys. And I think these are one of the most evocative things we have, not on display usually in the Mackintosh house, but usually in store here at Kelvin Hall. But they're extremely evocative of what life might have been like in the house. And the key that because they would have been handled by the people who lived there and used every day to access different rooms. Unfortunately, not all of them are labelled, so we don't know what they locked or unlocked. But some of them are labelled, and the one that I've highlighted here is the key to the coal cellar. And one of the things we did recently in redisplaying the introductory space before you enter the Mackintosh house is give some attention to the role of servants in the running of the house, rather than thinking of it just as the artistic home of this artist couple, thinking of it as a house which had to be managed and serviced by two servants. And this key, I think, is a lovely link with that workaday aspect of the house, because, as you can see, it was the key to the coal cellar. And that's the point that I want to end on. And I think it's a good point at which to end, because I think keys are one of those things that link us to buildings. They link us to the buildings that we live in now and that we use every day. But also, I'm sure all of us have got old keys in a drawer at home which unlock a place where we used to live, a place where we used to work, and provide a tangible link with a building that was significant in our past. And that's what this display is really about. It's about how we link to the past and through buildings and through objects that remind us of those buildings. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Joseph. We've got some time for any questions, and you can pop them in the chat and I will read those out for you. The thing about keys is quite interesting because if you do find an old key, you tend not to throw it away, even if you don't know what it unlocks, just in case it is important. I had a couple of questions, Joseph, just around like the curation of the display and the selection of the buildings. And I wondered if like there are any other buildings that you know of, like, you know, relics of those buildings existing in the Hunterian collections that possibly could have formed part of this display. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Initially, we thought of focusing on the School of Art for one of the buildings because we do have some material in the collection that's relevant to that. And also, after the two fires that affected that building. For instance, after the first fire, there was an art project was carried out which involved commissioning artists to make things from fire damaged debris from the building. And so that tragedy gave rise to interesting artifacts that it might have been possible to represent here. But I think because of the state of affairs at the art school and the uncertainty about its future at the moment, we decided it wasn't appropriate to do that, and we don't really have enough material. So in the end, these three buildings were the obvious choices because we've got sufficient material to fill these cases, and it just so happens there are three of them and there are three cases, so that was a happy accident. But we do have representations of other vanished buildings, but I think not the same range of interesting artifacts that we've got for these three buildings.
Thank you. And also I wondered with the objects, if there was any surprises. So once you sort of selected the buildings that you were looking at, I mean, were you already aware of these objects existing in the collections, or were there things that you discovered as you were curating this?
There were quite a lot of things that I hadn't actually physically seen or handled. I was aware of their existence. I might have seen a photograph of them in our catalogue, but hadn't actually looked at the object itself. And it's always a revelation to see the thing in the flesh, as it were, and understand its size and its texture and its condition and things like that. I was only dimly aware that we had these keys, and it was fantastic to unpack those and see what they were like, and also read those labels, because that information wasn't included in our catalogue record. And had I known about these keys, I think I would have included them, or some of them, in our display that introduces visitors to the Mackintosh house, because I think they're so evocative of that world of the servants in that house. So yes, they were a revelation for sure.
Amazing. There's a question in the chat here from Lola, which just says, beside objects as memories from these buildings, are there any signage from the site of these buildings? Are there any signage in the site of these buildings you discussed that marks where they were?
I understand. Yes, no, that's a good question. I think I'm right in saying that there is, or was, a plaque on the High Street site commemorating where the university was. I think I'm right in saying that we have in our collection a plaque which once was displayed on that site, but then the building that it was attached to was demolished, and so that orphaned plaque has passed into our collection. But I have a feeling there is still some commemoration on the site. But the other two buildings, the exhibition building and 78 Southpark Avenue, I don't believe there is any commemoration on the site, and that is a very good point. The 78 Southpark Avenue, the house where the Mackintoshes lived, I think I'm not sure that it actually occupied the site which is now occupied by the Fraser building. I think it probably occupied the car park or driveway that leads to the car park, just to the right of that. It may have slightly overlapped with it, but I think there is definitely scope there for um, for commemorating the building on its site, but also maybe for doing something creative, actually, that evokes the building in an imaginative way. I think that would be an interesting thing to do. There's a whole gable end there of the adjoining house, which is ripe for use in some way to commemorate the lost building that neighboured it.
Amazing. And just one last question in the chat from Kevin, who says, I find that I can't recall buildings that were local to me just a few years ago and wish I'd taken photographs at the time. How easy is it to find images of vanished buildings? And do you think there are images of old buildings out there in the hands of the public yet to be found?
Yes, well, that's a great question. And I think we all have that experience of something that we were so familiar with, saw every day, and it was that part of our lives, and then it's gone, and we can't remember what it looked like. It's it's an extraordinary piece of evidence for the fallibility of human memory. Obviously, with the internet, we have access to images in a way that we never had before, and it's extraordinary what you can find online. And there's that site Lost Glasgow, I think, which is particularly good, but there are others as well, and just simple, Google searches will regularly turn things up. I'm sure there are photographs in the hands of private individuals, and it would be nice to think that one day they might get donated to libraries or archives where they could be catalogued and made more widely available. Yes, I can't think of any other advice to offer than that. One problem about the ease with which we can now take photographs is that they're so numerous that we then can't catalog them or list them in a way that makes them retrievable, or we can, but it requires a lot of effort. And also, digital images are ephemeral in a way that printed photographs were not. So we have drawers and albums of old prints from the past, but what will happen to the thousands of photographs on our phones, and will they vanish with us?
Bring back analog. Thank you so much, Joseph, and thank you everyone for joining us online today. I've just popped a link in the chat to our website, which will tell you about our upcoming exhibition celebrating Glasgow 850. And also, it's worth saying that for Glasgow residents, every Sunday this year, you can visit the Mackintosh House for free between 10 a.m. and 12 noon. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and thank you, Joseph, for this week's talk. And I hope you all have a lovely weekend when it comes to it.